writing this book, I was trying to solve a really simple problem, which is that companies have been spending about $8 billion a year on diversity and inclusion, and unfortunately, not moving the needle very much, if at all. And the simple message of the book is that companies have been using the wrong tools. That, if a company had a problem with sales, you wouldn't hold like a deep, sincere conversation about how much everybody values sales and dedicate National Celebrate Sales Month and expect anything to change. But unfortunately, that's a lot of what we've been doing in the DEI context, the diversity, equity, and inclusion context. And, the simple message is that businesses need to use basic business tools to solve this business problem, the same ones they use to solve any business problem: evidence, metrics, and persistence until they achieve their concrete, measurable goals. What really surprised me in writing this book was not much. I've been studying this stuff for over 15 years. But I'll go back and tell you what did surprise me the first time these findings began to emerge, the findings that are now super well documented. One of the very first projects I did was wrote a book actually with my daughter called What Works for Women at Work. And for that book, we interviewed highly successful women, and I just told them, here are the patterns of gender bias that show up in the literature. Any of that sound familiar? Now, I knew a lot of these had happened to me, but I didn't know how common they were. And I was completely shocked to find that 96% of the women I interviewed had encountered these commonly documented forms of gender bias. And then when I started to study racial bias very intensively, I was really, really shocked at the level of disrespect that professionals of color report in the workplace. I mean, as a white woman, a lot of stuff happens. A lot of it's great. A lot of it's not so great. But that the kind of raw disrespect reported, especially by African Americans, I found deeply, deeply shocking. One of the things we find with dazzling consistency is that there's 5 basic patterns of bias. The first is prove it again. Some groups have to prove themselves more than others. Often, a certain group of white men are judged on their potential, but everybody else actually has to have delivered before they get the same kind of opportunities. The second we call the tightrope, and that's that office politics is more complicated for some groups than others. Short description: white men just need to be authoritative and ambitious, but other groups need to find a way of being authoritative and ambitious in a way that's seen as appropriate for their groups. So a woman who is being very hard driving may be seen as difficult or having sharp elbows. A African American man, for example, who's being very assertive in a business context in a way that in a white man might be seen as showing a career enhancing passion for the business, might be written off as intimidating or angry. And we find, particularly in tech, for example, that Latinas often, when again they're being authoritative in the context of a business disagreement, are seen as being emotional or even feisty. And feisty is such an interesting word because it basically says you are displaying authoritativeness in a way that I am coding as merely cute. The third pattern, which is also triggered both by race and by gender, we call the tug of war. And that's when bias against a group fuels conflicts within the group. That syndrome often happens when women are pitted against each other for the one woman's slot. And this can happen if people of color are pitted against each other for the one diversity slot. So that's when bias against a group really freights the relationships within the group. And then the fourth pattern, which is actually the strongest pattern of gender bias is the maternal wall, gender bias triggered by motherhood. Mothers are stereotyped as less competent and committed than other people. The final pattern is racial stereotypes and experiences that differ by group and that haven't been picked up by these other four patterns. So, for example, as I mentioned, African Americans often experience very high levels of social isolation and disrespect. Asian Americans are stereotyped by white people as good for technical matters, but not having leadership potential. These are the 5 patterns that show up with just remarkable consistency in our data sets, which are now, approaching 20,000 people. One of the standards approaches to DEI is to say, well, we just need to hire more women and people of color. And that's a really important initiative. Totally endorse it. Not the answer. Because what we have seen over the past 25 years is many, many organizations hiring women and hiring people of color and then having them leave. The really important message is that you have to interrupt bias in your basic business systems, not only in hiring, but in performance evaluations, where these 5 patterns of bias very commonly play out. We've done studies and worked with organizations to correct this. And very, very importantly, in access to opportunities. So if we keep hiring women and people of color, and then they don't see a future for themselves because they're not getting fair access to career enhancing opportunities, the handwriting is on the wall, they will leave. What our studies show is that white men report really high levels of fair access to career enhancing opportunities, sometimes as high as 87%. And for example, in one data set, we found that only 53% of Black women reported fair access to career enhancing assignments. So for far too long, organizations have focused on hiring, but they haven't focused on changing the conditions once people have been hired. I have a very reassuring message to first of all, to CFOs, which is, here's an invitation to stop throwing money at the problem and not solving it. And the reassuring message to CEOs is that all you need to do is use basic business tools. Very often in recent years, the focus has been on having kind of a deep, sincere conversation about how much we all value conclusion. And those conversations are not useless. They are helpful, but a sincere conversation is not an effective organizational change strategy. It just isn't. So what you need to do as a CEO and as a company is to use this 40 years of research on exactly how bias plays out on the ground, and to go back in your business systems and to begin to correct for these various biases. And that really highlights another reason why we've seen so little progress. The solution recently has been, we have a problem, let's hire a head of DEI. But often the heads of DEI are not set up to succeed because you hire a head of DEI and then you put on programming. That's what she has a budget for. But in order to be successful, that head of DEI needs authority to be able to change the performance evaluation system. So you need very close authority between DEI and HR. Also, the head of DEI needs to be able to change access and equalize access to plum assignments. So the head of DEI, in order to be successful, needs the ability to provide input on who gets that flow of career enhancing assignments. COVID has made all of this better, and COVID has made all of this worse. Both are true. One of the things that COVID did was finally normalized workplace flexibility. I was one of the red generation that literally invented those arrangements back in the 90s. And we knew that the only thing holding them back was a failure of imagination. That failure of imagination was remedied in 3 weeks' time in March 2020. And so now we have remote and hybrid work that's been more normalized. And that could really enhance opportunities for mothers and opportunities for people of color, because families of color are less likely to have a sole dominant breadwinner than white families are. On the other hand, just as the transition to hybrid could really enhance DEI, it could really corrode DEI goals as well. And that's if it's not handled well. For example, if you have a situation where more white men are coming back and working full-time on site, and you have on-site favoritism going on, then the people who are working remote are not going to thrive, and they are going to leave. And that's going to be predominantly women and people of color. If you start out from the evidence and you use these very concrete tools, you can make progress in short order on DEI, which I think is welcome news to a lot of people. On the Bias Interrupters website, we have lots of open access tools. I would really urge people to go to www.biasinterrupters.org and please steal our stuff.